The fate of your life and the rest of the human race is dependent on your ability to control your release of this molecule, dopamine. But wait, now I've satisfied your curiosity, and before you consider clicking off of this video, you've just demonstrated 2 ways of how dopamine controls your behaviour. Number 1, it's what's caused you to click on this video to find something potentially valuable. But number 2, if you have considered clicking off, it's what's given you that urge to stop the video and find something else potentially more valuable. So, to satisfy your dopaminergic urge to want to find something useful in the future, I promise that if you dedicate your time and attention to this video, you'll learn why you always fall into ruts and how to get out of them, why you struggle to focus, why you're still addicted to that thing, whatever it is, why you always crave more and are never satisfied, and how to like doing hard things, like a pug likes licking bacon off of a screen. Any excuse to get that video in, I wanted to find it. So now everyone else has cleared off and it's just you and me, let's get into it. By the way, I did try to draw a scientist in a lab coat, which quickly turned into a 5-year-old in an oversized lab coat with jester's boots on. I'm not drawing that again. Anyway, welcome back to the channel. It's lovely to have you back as always. Delayed wink there. Or welcome to the channel. My name is Lewis. We're going to cover a lot of principles in this video. So unlike any video you've seen before, we're going to keep a list of the principles on screen whenever we cover them so you can always see them. First of all, we're going to cover a brief overview of dopamine, everything you need to understand about it, and then we're going to finalize this video by covering 8 protocols to help you leverage your release of dopamine so that you can flourish. Okay, Lewis, so what is dopamine? Dopamine is otherwise known as a neurotransmitter. A neurotransmitter is a chemical released in your brain which helps neurons talk to each other. It's released in the gap between 2 neurons called a synapse, and a neuron is your brain's computing power. There's about 86 billion of them in your brain, and they talk to each other. And they talk to each other by sending these squirts of chemicals out in between their gaps called neurotransmitters. Now, depending on what neurotransmitters are released between neurons, that determines how you feel, how you act, and what you think at any given moment in time. But the release of neurotransmitters are very much like a presidential election, in the sense that if enough neurons send out the same chemical message, then that action that message wants you to perform will be performed. If you want to go deeper into all of this, rather than bombarding you with a load of neuroscience, feel free to check out the deep dive we did into depression. But if there's only one thing you understand about dopamine from this video, I want it to be this. Dopamine is the molecule of more. It's what motivates you to pursue what you don't yet have. To give you a quick analogy, imagine you're hiking and you've reached the peak that you were aiming for. In that moment of you standing on top of that peak, dopamine isn't what enables you to feel appreciation and satisfaction with your accomplishment, looking at all of the rocks and the view thinking, oh my god, this is so beautiful. Dopamine is what causes you to look out at the other peak that is 10 times higher than the one you're standing on and think, oh, imagine if we climbed that. Dopamine is commonly confused as the molecule of happiness because the initial studies that were conducted to discover it used drugs on rats. So people conflated the correlation of, oh, drugs make you happy, this new molecule must be the happiness molecule. But dopamine is to happiness what petrol is to a car. It's integral that you have petrol in order for your car to work, but standing there and filling your car with petrol until it overflows isn't going to help you at all. But just before we cover the protocols, there's a few more analogies about dopamine I want to give you to really consolidate your understanding. Not quite sure where that drawing came from, but the best way to think about dopamine is imagine it as an excellent salesman who has no conscience and always leaves you wanting more. It's the dopamine circuitry in your brain that can help you steer clear from engaging in immediate pleasure to pursue something more valuable potentially in the future. On the flip side, and more bad side, of course, dopamine is also what pulls you into the present moment to act on your impulsive desires and addictions, spiraling you further down into the rut you're currently in. Okay, let's finalize this segment with the last 2 analogies of dopamine, as it's very dark in my room because the English weather has gone incredibly grey. as usual. Hello darkness, my old friend. If we take the typical ethical example of, okay, you're sat in a train operating room and you have to make a decision as to whether you divert a running train towards track 1 with 1 person trapped on it, or track 2 with 5 people trapped on it. If you make the decision through the lens of dopamine, you're going to make a cold, rational decision, meaning you're just going to divert the train towards the track with 1 person on it. However, there's other molecules, neurotransmitters in your brain that balance out your dopamine's orientation with the future. They're otherwise known as here and now molecules. You might have heard of them before. Serotonin, oxytocin, vasopressin, endocannabinoids. They are what pull you into the present moment and foster your feelings of connectedness to the present, especially when you're in conversation with someone or when you're engaged in whatever you're doing right now. Now, that might beg the question of why would our brain have 2 opposing systems that work like an accelerator and a brake? Why not just have 1 unified system? It's a great question, and the answer is there's going to be times in your life where you're going to need to be focused with the future and dopaminergically pursue what you don't yet have, and there's going to be times where you're going to have to hang back and appreciate what you have. So in this situation, through the lens of here and now molecules, you're more likely to not make a harsh, cold, rational decision. You're more likely to tap into the empathy you feel for everyone involved and very much struggle to make a decision. But remember what I said at the beginning of this video. The fate of your life and the human race is dependent on your ability to control your release of dopamine. What I really wanted to say was the fate of your life and the human race is dependent on your ability to balance your striving for more dopamine with your appreciation for what you already have, here and now molecules. And through the lens of dopamine, this explains why some geniuses can be dicks. For example, the famous Russian author Fyodor Dostoevsky famously said, "The more I love humanity in general, the less I love man in particular. In my dreams, I often make plans for the service of humanity, yet I am incapable of living in the same room with anyone for 2 days together. I become hostile to people the moment they come close to me." Geniuses, creative individuals, high achievers, all have very high levels of dopamine, which is required for what they do to come up with new ideas and bring projects into actualization in the real world, that they don't have as much of a balance in their here and now molecules to help them connect with someone one-on-one when they're having a conversation or when they're socializing. They're always fascinated with the future and getting more, that sometimes it's very hard to talk to them and socialize with them. Because remember, dopamine comes without a conscience, meaning without empathy. But the most important analogy of dopamine is, think of your dopamine levels existing like a scale, with your baseline always being at 5. For example, you're watching YouTube now, depending on how long you've been scrolling for. That means your dopamine levels are currently at about a 7. But as soon as you stop watching YouTube, they're going to have an equal and opposite drop down to a 3 in order for your brain's dopamine levels to return to baseline. And this highlights our first principle of the day. The benefits that pleasure confers must be paid back. Dr. Anna Lemke, who is a renowned psychiatrist, wrote a superb book called Dopamine Nation, which has inspired a lot of what I'm talking about in this video. And when I read it, it blew my mind, because what she highlights is that there is a pleasure and pain balance in your brain, which is your brain is always trying to maintain homeostasis in the same way that your body is trying to maintain homeostasis regards to your temperature levels, hunger, and your thirst. And this pleasure-pain balance in your brain is mediated by dopamine, which is highlighted here in the scale. Another way of saying this is nothing comes for free. For each activity you engage in that spikes your dopamine above baseline, there is an equal and opposite drop down below baseline your brain needs to engage in order for it to come back up to baseline. And this allows us to highlight a concept of differentiation between 2 different types of dopamine. Technically, neuroscientifically, there's only one type of dopamine, of course, but it just helps to look at things through the lens of concepts. We have slow and fast dopamine. In relation to this scale, you can probably guess that fast dopamine is anything that shoots you above baseline, like we can see here, and then instantly shoots you back down because of the pleasure principle. Nothing comes for free. Slow dopamine is on the flip side. So, by the way, of course, when you look at it through the lens of the pleasure-pain balance that we just mentioned, tapping on the fast side of the dopamine equation, you're tapping on the pleasure side of the balance and avoiding pain, which means that when you shift back, sorry, this is getting a bit messy on the board, but when you shift back, your brain has to shift back towards pain in order to get back up to baseline. So, slow dopamine is anything that you engage in where you tap on the pain side of the equation initially, but guess what? In reverse, that also means after you engage in that thing, you can shoot back up above baseline, so your brain compensates for it. Okay, let's give ourselves some space. And a second concept I want to introduce you to in regards to dopamine is dopamine stacking. Because you can have an understanding of what type of activities fast dopamine includes, such as scrolling, fapping, eating junk food, playing video games, anything that results in an instant spike. Dopamine stacking is where you do multiple of those activities at the same time. So you scroll on your phone while eating junk food with the TV on or video games on in the background. Straight up to 10. But as soon as you stop that thing, straight down to 0 because your brain needs to compensate for the increase in pleasure. And when you look at it at a deeper level, this explains exactly why you get into ruts. Because you're at baseline and then you do something that spikes your dopamine, a bad habit, like we covered. And then that shoots you straight down below baseline. So you're here now. This is a horrible place to be because you feel the exact opposite of everything you felt when you was up here. When you're up here, you're scrolling, you're playing video games, you're eating junk food. So what do you feel? You feel excited, you feel pleasurable, you feel connected, you feel soothed and distant from your emotions. As soon as you go into this, what we call a dopamine deficit state, you feel the exact opposite. You feel groggy, you feel brain fog. You feel brain fog. You feel irritated. You feel lonely. You feel overwhelmed with your emotions. So, when you're in a rut, because that's a horrible place to be in a dopamine deficit state, what do? You continue doing these things in an attempt to get yourself above baseline. You go down even further. You try to go up more by doing that thing again. And you go down even further, delaying the time it takes your brain to get you back up to baseline, which is your normal, excited, motivated, happy self. But here's the interesting thing. You can see the depression, by depression I mean the decrease in the spikes of your dopamine. Because anything you expose yourself to in terms of fast dopamine, the more you engage in it, the less of a dopamine spike you get, which means the more of it you have to do in order to get the same level of spike, which means the more you plummet yourself down after you engage in that thing into a dopamine deficit state. Even when I observe myself get into ruts, the exact same thing happens. I don't know, for me, usually it's scrolling and eating my body weight in digestive biscuits when I'm fed up of eating healthy all of the time. So I shoot all the way up to 9, I go down, I hate this feeling, and I think, oh no, I want to get to where I was feeling before this feeling. I try to shoot myself back up by more scrolling. I go down even further, and I'm misunderstanding what I need to do in order to get out of the rut. Failure to get out of a rut shows a lack of understanding. That's going to sound judgmental, but it's not a problem in terms of solution, it's a problem in terms of a misunderstanding of how your brain works. We're going to get into it right now. So let's take it one concept further and conceptualize all of this by introducing you to a word you might not have heard before, or a concept you might not have heard before, but something you've definitely experienced before. Something we call dopamine hangovers. So dopamine hangovers are what we've just covered. It's when you go into a low dopamine deficit state as a consequence of tapping on the pleasure side of the equation. And as we mentioned, this is a horrible place to be. But more particularly, dopamine hangovers happen as a consequence of you transitioning from fast to slow dopamine, which is plummeting you down here. As soon as you stop scrolling, you instantly shoot down, and you're now faced with the reality of slow dopamine from your environment. No longer can you get that fast fix, which freaks you out, obviously, so you jump back up here. And there's one thing I want to highlight with highlighting this again. If you haven't noticed already, what that sequence is addiction. Being in a dopamine deficit state, freaking yourself out, not wanting to be there, trying to shoot up above baseline, going down again even further, up and down and down. This is addiction. The one thing to note about addiction is you're not whatever you're addicted to, you're not addicted to the pleasure you get from doing that thing. You're addicted to avoiding the discomfort of being in a low dopamine deficit state. So you try to shoot back up by doing that thing again. A coffee addict isn't addicted to the pleasure they get from drinking coffee. They're addicted to escaping the uncomfortable feeling of anxiety and jitters whenever they're not drinking coffee. The scrolling addict, as most of us are, we're not addicted to the pleasure we get from scrolling. We're addicted to escaping the discomfort we feel when we're not scrolling. So this highlights our second principle of the day, which is you can't pour sugar into a cup of piss and expect it to taste nice. When you're here, you're in a rut. You're in a dopamine deficit state, obviously as a consequence of tapping on the pleasure side of the equation. To satisfy what I promised you at the beginning of this video of understanding why you get into ruts and how to get out of them, when you're in a rut, you need to unplug from fast dopamine and just understand that the way you get out of a rut is by giving your brain and body time and space to gradually bring your dopamine levels back up to baseline. Your brain and body know what to do, but you're delaying the process of your recovery and getting out of the rut and recovering from your addiction because you keep engaging in fast dopamine, depleting your dopamine stores so your brain can't recover. The more you try to focus on whatever you need to focus on or solve your being in a rut by engaging in more fast dopamine, you're trying to pour sugar into a cup of piss and expecting it to taste nice. So you don't need a solution, you need understanding in order to get out of a rut and break your addiction. To highlight what happens in particular when you unplug yourself from fast dopamine, whatever it is, scrolling, fapping, junk food, video games, and you quit cold turkey or you unplug cold turkey for a few days. What usually happens? You've probably experienced this before. Over a period of a week, the first few days, you feel terrible because you're not doing that thing. You're now in a dopamine deficit state, experiencing the complete opposite of everything you experienced when you were tapping on the pleasure side of the equation. But if you persist through the discomfort and the withdrawals of not doing that thing, and you sit with your emotions and your thoughts and all of the discomfort you was numbing yourself from by tapping on the pleasure side, what happens? Your brain gradually starts to rewire, your dopamine receptors come back, meaning you have more dopamine stores in your brain. You slowly return up to baseline, becoming your motivated, excited and happy self, meaning that when you're in the real world and you're in a conversation or you're in the woods and you see a piece of grass or you see a bird and you think, oh my God, nature's pretty cool, you know, I like conversations again. It's because you have the dopamine receptors available for you to enjoy that thing and feel motivated to do it. So I've given you the permission to uppercut anyone who, when you're in a dopamine deficit state, looks at your state of doom and gloom and says, oh, you're pretty depressed right now. Listen, man, life's beautiful. You just need to go out into the woods and just revel in the bliss of life. No, uppercut them because they don't understand. You don't have the dopamine receptors in your brain to feel motivated to do so or joyful when you do that. And lastly, this helps us understand why someone who's an addict prioritizes their addiction over anything else in their life. If you take the example of a man with a family of children, but he's an addict to something, whatever it is, you might think, how can you be an addict when you have such sources of joy in your life, such as your family? Well, it's because his addiction is the only thing that allows him to spark above baseline, because he's in this dopamine deficit state 24/7, which obviously up here he's engaging in fast dopamine because that's what his addiction offers him, a spike above baseline. His family is slow dopamine, which is that thing where when he engages in is resulting in him going below baseline in order to slowly come back up. But he's in this state most of the time, which means in order to get above, he needs his addiction. This highlights our third principle of the day. Hard choices, easy life. Easy choices, hard life. You now need to understand that from now until the rest of your life, the more you engage in fast dopamine, the harder your life is going to be. Because mentally, you're continuously putting yourself in this dopamine deficit state after initial spikes. But the more you engage in slow dopamine, the easier your life will be, because the opposite happens. You have an initial plummet of excitement, resulting in a later increase above baseline in your dopamine levels. So if you're in a rut right now, you need to understand this principle. Hard choices. You stop scrolling. You stop eating junk food. You unplug from whatever you are dopaminergically hooked on at this moment in time, and understand there's a whole wave of discomfort coming your way. Emotions, thoughts, the complete opposite of everything you was feeling when you was tapping on the fast dopamine. But that's going to result in an easier life for you later on, 2 or 3 days time, as your brain and body gradually level out your dopamine receptors and levels back to baseline. You need to sit with the discomfort and understand that the discomfort is positive feedback, because the more discomfort you feel when you're in a rut means the more you're tapping on the slow dopamine side of the equation, unplugging from the fast dopamine, allowing your brain and body space to get yourself back up to baseline. Your body and brain know what to do. Slow dopamine and hard choices, we can use those terms interchangeably. What we mean is you work out, you do breath work, you journal, you meditate, you go for a walk, you cook a nutritious meal, you stop scrolling. They're just examples, not hard pills that you have to do those things. Easy life. Your easy life comes from you being at baseline levels rather than being depleted. The easy choice is to continue doing what you're doing, which is continue scrolling, continue eating the junk food, continue spiking yourself above baseline. But we know where that leads. Down here. And if you understand this, and you give your brain and body space to recover, and you lean into this principle, you'll be out of the rut within 2 to 3 days. Okay, we got a bit pumped there. Let's cover the protocols. Protocol number 1, to leverage your dopamine release and flourish in life and mentally, is seize all dopamine stacking and just do one thing at a time. By the way, all of these protocols are from a superb book called High on Life by David J.P. Phillips. Of course, we covered it a bit in that last sequence, but to give you even further examples of slow versus fast dopamine, slow dopamine activities, remember, of course, are anything that results in you going down below baseline levels in order to come back up above baseline, such as reading, training, socializing, puzzles, cold exposure. Don't worry, I'm not some alpha 4 a.m. wake up, do an ice bath, grind set bloke. These are just random examples. Fast dopamine, anything that results in a instant spike, instant downfall as soon as you stop doing it. Scrolling, junk food, drugs. But what we mean in particular by this first protocol of seize all dopamine stacking and just do one thing at a time is, let's say every time you work out, you listen to music, take a pre-workout, and you work out at the perfect time of day. This is dopamine stacking, because you're getting dopamine from the music, the pre-workout, the workout itself, and the perfect time of day in which you're working out at. This is taking dopamine away from your excitement and motivation and joy that you get from working out itself. So if you want to enjoy anything that you're doing more, remove all of the excess dopamine and supplementary dopamine you have around that activity and just do that activity. Sorry, he's got a wonky arm. Just work out, just study. Because the more you listen to music, for example, while you're doing these things, like we said, the more you're taking your dopamine away from the activity itself, meaning that you're going to feel less excited and motivated for that actual thing, which, of course, in the context of tricking your brain into liking doing hard things, tricking your brain to like doing hard things. Don't know why that doesn't sound grammatically correct, but this is what we mean. If you want to be more motivated and excited to do something, don't spike dopamine before you do that thing. Don't spike it after you do that thing. Learn to spike dopamine while you're doing that thing. Make doing that thing more enjoyable than doing anything else, and you'll be motivated to do it, no matter what it is. You might want to remind yourself when you're engaging in slow dopamine, this is hard and feels challenging, but that's just what I need to find it pleasurable. Which highlights our fourth principle of the day, lemon control. Dr. K, a renowned online psychiatrist, gives the analogy of a lemon for dopamine. The more you squeeze a lemon, the less juice you have inside of it. It's exactly the same for your dopamine levels and your energy levels throughout your day, which means the more you engage in things that drain your dopamine stores, the less dopamine you're going to have left over to engage in the things you want to now be motivated and excited to do. Even more importantly, do not engage in fast dopamine early in the day. Don't wake up and check your phone and scroll or eat junk food, because you're squeezing the lemon so early during the day, which means you're now going to have a terrible day after that because you're not going to feel motivated and excited and dopaminergically compelled to pursue anything else. Everything else is going to be hard. Remember, hard choices, easy life. Easy choices, hard life. Easy choice, wake up and scroll. Hard life, the rest of the day is terrible. Hard choice, wake up and put your phone away and do focused deep work or whatever you want to do. Easy life, you now feel accomplished because you've engaged in slow dopamine. And remember what we covered in terms of the dopamine hangover. If we go back to the scale, of course this is baseline. If you squeeze the lemon early in the day, boom, you're straight down. And now you've got to carry your dopamine deficit state into the remainder of the day, which you won't want to do. So what do? You get into a rut because you spike it like that. Again, that's what I do anyway when I'm in a rut. Okay, protocol number 2 is maintain the 80-20 rule. 80% of the time you want to be engaged in slow dopamine, 20% of the time you want to be engaged in fast dopamine, because you're unlikely to unplug completely from the fast dopamine the modern world offers us. So maintain this balance. Protocol number 3 to leverage dopamine is intermittent celebration. Control your release of dopamine whenever you achieve something. To give you an analogy, let's say you've been working on a project for 6 months and you finally complete it. You send it out to the world, you release it, and you get great feedback. So what do? That night, you go out and you celebrate. You spend the whole night out, you stay up late, you celebrate in whatever way you do. You drink, you eat crap food, and you stay up partying. Imagine then trying to work on the next project the next day. You're now in a dopamine deficit state after your celebration, which of course, hopefully it was worth it, but if it wasn't, you've just delayed your ability to work on the next project by at least a few days after you recover from your dopamine deficit. So, to offset this, you can still celebrate things, of course, but if you want to not plummet yourself down into a dopamine deficit state, celebrate a little but more often. Instead of celebrating your whole accomplishment in one night, celebrate 1 hour a day for 4 or 5 days. Or one thing I will never forget from my favourite author, Ryan Holiday, is celebrate the thing by doing more of the thing. For him, he's a writer. He celebrates hitting the New York Times bestseller list by writing the next book. Here's a little clip of him explaining this.
You know, after Belichick won his first Super Bowl, someone said, you know, what do we do next? And he said, we win more of them. And I don't know if that's exactly the right vibe, but I do. I'm gonna go work on the wisdom book a little bit as a celebration. All right, my tradition, which I've learned the hard way, is that you celebrate the noun getting the accomplishment or the achievement. You celebrate the noun by doing the verb, which is what I'm going to do now. And that is work on the next book.
Moving on, protocol number 4. Why do I rub the protocol out? Why don't I just keep that word in? Protocol number 4 is introduce dopamine variability. One more concept I want to introduce you to is reward prediction error, and dopamine loves it. Think about it. When you go onto social media, not every post you see is as eye-catching as the next. Within 15 posts, probably one of them really captures your attention. And this idea of random reward is what dopamine loves. So if you want to introduce more excitement into your life, use a dice or a die, whatever it's called, with a yes and no on it. And if you want to make low stakes decisions more exciting, throw it, and whatever it lands on, you make that decision. Of course, if it's a yes, go for it. If no, don't go for it. And lastly, don't reward yourself every time you do something, because that will likely become very boring as your brain starts to desensitize to the reward because it expects it. So reward yourself for doing something, a new habit, every now and then. Protocol number 5. Keep the protocol there this time. Create an emotional why. When we covered the differentiation between fast and slow dopamine, you might have got a bit confused contrasting that with what we said at the beginning of this video, which is dopamine is of course the molecule of more, and it is primarily what helps you stave off immediate pleasure and temptation in the here and now in pursuit of long-term gratification. That might have confused you considering what we covered about fast dopamine, which seems that it pulls you into the present moment to act on addictive behaviors. Well, the reason that dopamine can help you pursue delayed gratification is because of having an emotional why behind you. In order to pursue something in the future, as opposed to pulling yourself into the present moment and acting on fast dopamine, you need to highlight the usefulness of the thing that you're aiming for. I also sneakily did this quite blatantly at the beginning of this video by telling you, if you watch this video, what you're going to get out of it. So if you want to motivate yourself or feel excited to do something that you won't get the benefits of right now and is in the future, highlight all of the reasons why doing that thing is useful and the benefits that you will get if you pursue that thing. If you know that you could get a bigger reward later on for your efforts now, rather than pulling yourself into the present moment to experience an immediate, pleasurable, fast dopamine reward now, your dopamine stores are going to be much more in favor of you feeling excited and motivated to pursue the bigger, long-term reward you know is coming, or potentially coming. And this highlights our final principle of the day, which is you can want something you don't like and like something you don't want. Yes, wanting and liking are completely different things. To illustrate this, have you ever noticed that when you do scroll, you don't actually like it while you're scrolling? Which means that you want something that you don't actually like. On the flip side, have you ever not wanted to go to a social event, maybe a party or a social gathering, but when you're there, you enjoy it and you're grateful that you made the decision to go there? So you like something that you don't want. Linking this back to the protocol we just covered of create your emotional why, when you set a goal or you work towards something long-term that you know you'll potentially be rewarded for, that provides you with the necessary context of understanding this principle in those moments of temptation. When you feel tempted to scroll or engage in fast dopamine, which is going to contradict your ability to work towards this, you can reflect on this principle and realize, oh, just because I want to scroll TikTok or eat junk food doesn't mean I'm gonna like it when I do that thing. On the flip side, you can understand that just because you don't want to engage in the slow dopamine of working towards this thing, could be just because I don't want to work out right now, or just because I don't want to study, or just because I don't want to socialize, doesn't mean I'm not going to like it when I start doing this thing. It's just a bit of framing for you to keep close in those moments of temptation. Okay, 3 more. Protocol number 6 for leveraging your dopamine release is take a cold shower. He agrees. Oh, fucking dog. I should go pour a bucket of cold water over its head. Cold exposure increases your dopamine release by 250%. So, good thing to note, right? If you're in that dopamine deficit state down here, what is something you can do in terms of slow dopamine to get you a little bit closer to baseline or above? Take a cold shower. I take a cold shower every morning and it feels like I've got a rocket up my arse whenever I do so. 2 more. Protocol number 7. Protocol number 7 is create a vision board. This is connected also to the protocol of create an emotional why. You've probably heard this advice before, but take it from your internet brother from another mother. I highly recommend that you do it. I've got a vision board and I'm not going to show you everything. And it is imperative that you have a vision board and an idea of something you're striving towards in the future and something that you're running away from to steer the ship in those moments of temptation. To structure your vision board, I would say write your manifesto if you wish, but more specifically, thinking about the ideal version of yourself, consider, what do you look like? Where are you? What do you do? How do you earn money? And who are you with? Collect some photos and images for you to put on your vision board as well. I probably used enough ink to drown the whole of the UK when I was printing off this. 2 more things you might like to do is use 1 page to write your legacy. Now what you do is you do a mental exercise of imagining yourself at 90, 95 years old, reflecting on your life as you're about to take your last breath. What did you do? What did you accomplish? What are you proud of? Who did you spend your time with? What did you steer clear from? What values did you uphold? You might want to write down your principles. I have 9, some things to remember. And then lastly, one thing that is really good is write down your ideal week. You can do this in Google Calendar, print it out, take a screenshot of it, so you understand the ideal life that you're striving for. If you can see it, then you can achieve it, and all that. Finally, it's happened to me. Protocol number 8, keep intrinsic motivation the main thing. Do not rely on external validation to fuel your excitement and motivation, because it's fleeting. And remember what we said a few moments ago, don't reward yourself every time you do this thing that you would like to do more, whatever habit it is. There was an interesting study done at Harvard where they took kids who loved to draw, started to reward them for drawing, and the kids' desire to draw decreased. In summary, principles were, sorry I got lazy and put P instead of principles. Number 1, seize all dopamine stacking and just do one thing at a time. Maintain the 80-20 rule. 80% of the time you're engaged in slow dopamine, 20%, give yourself a bit of fast dopamine. Number 3, use intermittent celebration. Schedule out your celebrating rather than doing it all in one go to avoid getting into a dopamine deficit state. Number 4, is that spelled right? Introduce dopamine variability. If you want more excitement into your life, carry a dice that says yes or no around it and throw it whenever you're making low stakes decisions. Number 5, create an emotional why behind what you're trying to achieve in the future to give you that motivation and excitement. 6, take a cold shower. 7, create a vision board. Number 8, keep intrinsic motivation the main thing. The principles were, the benefits that pleasure confers must be paid back. You can't pour sugar into a cup of piss and expect it to taste nice. Telling you that from experience. Hard choices, easy life. Easy choices, hard life. Lemon control. Remember, dopamine is like a lemon. The more you squeeze, the less you have. You can want something you don't like and like something you don't want. And if you're in a rut right now, remember, unplug from fast dopamine, sit with the discomfort, and allow your body and brain space to return to baseline levels. Thank you very much for your time and attention that you've dedicated to this video. I appreciate you as always. And by the way, if you want me to do a series of videos just like this, covering the other neurotransmitters and how to maximize your release of them so you flourish in life from the book High on Life, comment an emoji of a brain and a light bulb, and then the third emoji is your favorite emoji. Otherwise, stay disciplined, playful, and dangerous. Adios, muchachos y muchachas. I'm gonna go kill a dog.